ताली बजाओ, पहले वहाँ बोल रहे हैं।
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present my views on the budget, which the Honourable Finance Minister gave us. I would like to begin by congratulating the Honourable Finance Minister for her maiden budget and the first of this new government in their second innings. It's indeed a matter of pride for all of us in this august House and country that this was the second ever budget that was delivered by a woman since Srimati Indira Gandhi presented the budget way back in 1970. And on behalf of my party, I would like to extend my deepest appreciation for the Honourable Finance Minister for recreating history. Now, it's a traditional practice for the opposition to hold the government accountable for its performance, including the announcement of the budget. But before I do so, I would like to place on record my personal admiration for the Honourable Finance Minister, whom I've known for some years. It was a marvellous touch to bring a dose of Tamil Sangam poetry into this House with her verse about the elephant and the paddy field. But I cannot resist pointing out that her metaphor accurately makes her government a slow-moving elephant again, whereas what we were all hoping for was an agile, bounding, lithe tiger. Sadly, this budget, with its creeping incrementalism, devoid of any bold proposal, falls considerably short of unleashing the animal spirits that John Maynard Keynes spoke about. The poor animal of the Indian economy, this lumbering and limping elephant, still remains leashed and fettered as it has been for the last 5 years. But one cannot blame her entirely for the abject disappointment that has once again been caused by an underwhelming budget, Mr. Chairman, because the fact is that she's had to inherit the mess that the government has spent 5 years in power creating. The legacy of economic mismanagement that has featured a disastrous demonetization, unemployment at a 45-year high, agrarian distress that has raised farmer suicides to record levels, declining rates of savings and investment, and widespread stagnation in every area from manufacturing to exports. It's with deep regret, Mr. Chairman, that I note the budget that was presented last week was characterized by a rather modest, if not mediocre, set of announcements, distinctive misses, deafening silences on matters of substance, and the utterly evident insincerity of this government to truly offer a way forward to the people of our country from the series of crises that they have been afflicted with since the first innings of this government. Since cricket is on our minds these days with the World Cup semi-final tomorrow, let me say that instead of the bold boundaries we expected in this first budget after the elections, what we have are unnecessarily defensive strokes, dropped catches, and quite a few no balls and wides. Moreover, the budget reflects yet another complete disregard for the genuine concerns, hopes, and aspirations of our people who have given a fresh mandate to this government. It must be said that it's not we in the opposition that the government has failed by offering these terms of disappointment. Rather, it's the mandate of the people of India that the government has chosen to squander at the beginning of its tenure. As Mirza Ghalib famously observed, "Bujh jate hain ye kabhi tel ki kami se bhi, har baar kusur hawa ke jhonkon ka nahi hota." This is what has happened to our country. Kusur kisi aur ka nahi hai, aapki sarkar ki tel ki kami ke hain. Now, there were some remarkable aspects to this budget, but these, Mr. Chairman, came from what was not said in the budget speech rather than what was. This is perhaps the first budget in the history of the country where allocations, the engine of the document, were not mentioned. For over 2 hours we waited for announcements of substance, but had to make do with an hour-long recitation of the so-called achievements of the first term and grandiose promises of fluff for the coming decade. When the people of India wanted concrete answers to the problems of today, we had to go and look into the documents afterwards. I must say we were left with a sort of Trishanku budget, neither here nor there. And at its heart, this kind of modest incrementalism wedded to some lofty ideals for a grand future. But sadly, no indication of a comprehensive and robust strategy or roadmap to get to that lofty vision. And from the Aam Aadmi's perspective, just a series of missed opportunities and uninspired reiterations of existing ideas. To start with, the macroeconomic situation of our country's economy was not even considered worth a mention in the budget speech. Can't blame them. The mess they've made doesn't really make for a pretty picture worth mentioning after all. There was strikingly no mention of the country's GDP growth rate. In fact, the word GDP was only mentioned once, and that was with regard to the external debt to GDP ratio. And the principal contributors to GDP, investment levels, manufacturing, consumption, and even the government's dubious fiscal deficit target was only mentioned amusingly after the official speech concluded as an afterthought. But since the government has intentionally failed to provide a fuller picture, let me begin by doing their job for them. Respected Chairman, the economic survey was presented last Thursday on Budget Eve, makes a rather optimistic projection of 7% GDP growth in the upcoming fiscal year. In fact, it goes on to mention that during the last quarter of the fiscal year, the growth rate will even pick up to 7.5 or 7.6%. And it will be a step towards hitting this 8% growth rate, which is, of course, integral to achieving the PM's target of a $5 trillion economy by the year 2024-25. I don't know where they're getting their figures from. Last time there was a concern they were getting their economics from a yoga teacher. But certainly here, there is a real credibility issue with any of these numbers. As the government's own last chief economic advisor has pointed out, our current growth rates could in reality be as much as 2.5 points lower than what is being projected.
Yes.
The government has offered to present a point-by-point rebuttal to the methodology used by Dr. Subramaniam to arrive at this conclusion, but they've still not come through to Parliament on this. Similarly, we all remember the controversy about the GDP back series, which was kicked up last year when Niti Aayog brought in yet another method to calculate GDP in a manner that boosted the growth on paper of the NDA government while bringing it down retrospectively for the UPA government, a move that invited widespread condemnation from experts around the world. The recurring high-profile departure of experts from the administration, the latest being the Deputy Governor of the RBI, also does not inspire confidence in the credibility of the numbers offered by this government. Traditional economic wisdom dictates that the GDP of a country will only grow if the key contributions to it expand, such as investment, manufacturing, consumption, exports. But here we have a peculiar situation where none of these is growing. And in fact, many have actually hit rock bottom. But the government still believes we're going to be growing at 7 to 8% in the future without explaining how this is going to happen. Let us not forget that the GDP growth rate in the most recent quarter is considerably lower than such fevered fantasies at a rather tepid 5.8%. The finance minister, at the onset of her speech, echoed the economic survey by emphasizing the central role of investment to propel the economy, pointing out that we need to invest heavily in infrastructure, in digital economy, in job creation, in small and medium firms. And of course, she's right in this regard, but according to the Center for the Monitoring of the Indian Economy, CMIE, which has tracked project announcements and implementation in the June quarter, investment, both private and public, has shockingly gone down by 81%, not 8.1. Investment has gone down by 81% from the previous quarter and was still 87% from the same quarter last year. Now, this reflects an alarming decline in both public and private investment and an overall 15-year low. Our manufacturing and services sectors have been particularly hit, with the former falling by 68% from the previous year and the latter by 98% from the previous year. And this horror story only gets worse. So where does the government's optimism about investment come from? Who is going to invest? How are they going to invest? And why aren't they investing now? Projects to the tune of nearly 13 trillion rupees are currently stalled. And the stalling rate, that's the percentage of projects based on the percentage of projects under implementation in the private sector, has already hit a new record in Indian history, a record high of 26.1% in the June quarter. 27.2% of manufacturing projects are stalled, 20.4% of power projects are solved, and together with the services sector, these three account for 92% of the total stalled projects. Ask any industrialist what will it take for him to invest in the present Indian economy, and he will tell you, improve consumption so that people will buy what we make. Otherwise, why are we going to invest and make something that people can't buy? This is the challenge that the finance minister has failed to address in her budget. But consumption levels also in any case tell a negative tale. According to the Society for Indian Automobile Manufacturers, automobile sales fell by 20.6% in May, the steepest decline in 18 years, which in turn has arrested manufacturing and demanded inventory correction, causing total production in the automobile segment to fall by 8%. Two-wheeler sales fell by 17.3% in the fiscal year 19, and even traditionally strong movers of consumption like fast-moving consumer goods are likely to fall by an overall 2% according to a report published by the market analytics and information firm Nielsen. The slowdown in consumption, which was alluded to in the economic survey but strangely skipped in the budget speech, has also affected India's prime services sector. And the Nikkei India Services Business Activity Index, or PMI, fell to 49.6 in the June quarter, the lowest this year. And what's interesting is that any figure above 50 indicates expansion. Anything below signals a contraction. And in this case, it's the first contraction since this government presided over one contraction in May 2018. Now, the decline in all these key indicators makes it clear there's an acute trust deficit amongst investors, coupled with low consumer confidence in the economy, for which this government, in the budget, has neither addressed nor provided a roadmap on how it will turn the situation around. The hasty and ill-thought-through demonetization bears a large share of the responsibility for shutting down lakhs of small and micro-enterprises, throwing many more lakhs of people out of work. As a well-known couplet tells us, "Ye jabr bhi dekha hai, तारीख की नजरों में ये जबर भी देखा है तारीख की नजरों ने लम्हों ने खता की थी सदियों ने सजा पाई." हम सजा पा रहे हैं, Mr. Chairman. We also have to consider the new research that has been published recently by Harvard Center for International Development based on its Economic Complexity Index for 133 countries, which is a measure of the diversity and sophistication of the productive capabilities reflected in the exports of a country. And they say that India will only manage an average annual growth of 5.5% until 2027, whereas China, they say, will continue to remain the fastest growing major economy at 6.1%. We had that title very briefly under this government. We've lost it. As for the fiscal deficit target, the announcement that the government is again targeting 3.3% hardly inspires any confidence, because this 3.3% is the same figure they announced last year and failed to meet. So we all recall how my good friend Arun Jaitley kept having to adjust his fiscal deficit targets every year. For another, the fact is the government's assumption is entirely based on a growth in tax revenue to offset increased government spending on schemes like Ayushman Bharat and the expanded version of PM Kisan, which they've allocated some good money to. But as the economic survey itself highlights, while direct tax improved by 13.4%, the gross tax to GDP ratio actually fell to 10.9%, a decrease of 0.3%, as indirect taxes fell by 16% due to shortcomings in the GST, which, by the admission of the government's own economic advisors, requires a mop-up. Now, in the present scenario, how will this government finance the deficit, and how will they map this target of 3.3 when their projections themselves are highly contestable? Now, they're going to suggest perhaps that they'll make up a little bit of non-tax receipts, namely the self-declared disinvestment target of 1 trillion rupees, right? But we all know how the government has so far played the disinvestment game, by getting one public sector company to buy shares in another public sector company, which is not disinvestment at all, but fudging the books. Now the government is hoping for a lakh of crores by selling loss-making Air India. But when the far more successful Jet Airways has failed to find a buyer, who's going to bid for Air India? Similarly, I'd like to draw the attention of this House to the government's continued failure to give the country any relief on direct taxation. My esteemed senior colleague, Mr. Chidambaram, had in 2009 proposed a direct tax code to replace the complex and outdated Income Tax Act of 1961 and bring India's tax ecosystem in line with the demands of a fast-growing economy. However, despite having constituted a task force to propose draft legislation on direct taxation, This government has failed to provide any tangible rollout plan for this much-needed tax reform, and the task force's deadline keeps getting extended. The way the Pakistanis keep extending the duration of the courts for the 2611 trial, same thing. Now, the last extension to 31 July has taken the overall delay to over a year, and this is supposed to be going to have been the first budget of the new government. Now, the government did seek to provide short-term stops to the Aam Aadmi. There's an additional income tax deduction of 1.5 lakhs on affordable home loans. But given the higher excise duty they've also imposed on essential items for the home, like ceramic tiles, marble flooring, electronics, mountings for furniture, which are imported mainly because, of course, they're cheaper, the savings may well be more than offset by higher costs for all these items. Similarly, they've given a deduction of 1.5 lakhs on loans towards the purchase of electric vehicles. But given the complete lack of public infrastructure and government investment to support electric vehicles, repeated power failures in every part of the country. I'm living in Lutyens, Delhi. I go through 4 or 5 power cuts a day. And the absence of any grid or cabling to support the much higher power load that would be needed to charge electric cars, these additional deductions are meaningless. Meanwhile, when the Aam Aadmi is already paying the highest fuel prices in the world because of this government's taxes on petrol and diesel, at a time when prices for fuel are dropping worldwide, now the finance minister has added an extra 2 rupees plus on every litre of diesel or petrol at a time of international low prices of crude oil. This is adding insult to injury. I must say, not only is it not fair for the finance minister to suggest that only those who own private vehicles, I believe she said that in the press conference, would be affected. The fact is that the आम आदमी जो एक कमीज या चप्पल खरीदने जाते हैं बाजार को, वो चप्पल और कमीज तो फैक्ट्री से बाजार पहुंचने के लिए कोई पेट्रोल डीजल वाली गाड़ी नहीं आई है. So naturally, the manufacturer will pass the burden on to the consumer, to the आम आदमी. So this is a continuation of the BJP government's established practice of dangling a carrot before the citizen, and while he's not looking, distracted by all this hoopla, pulling whatever cash he has in him out of his pockets. So while the Honourable Finance Minister did quote ancient poetry to thank the taxpayer, allow me to offer a more recent poem, which I modified from one that's currently in circulation, circulation on the BJP's favourite medium, WhatsApp, that rather aptly captures the present situation. Tax his car, tax his wage, tax his book on every page. Tax his fuel, his credit card. If he screams, tax him hard. Tax his newsprint, tax his drink. Tax him if he tries to think. Tax his bosses, tax his peers. If he cries, tax his tears. Tax his pay, tax his phone, tax his house, tax his loan. If he thinks this is a sin, tell him it's his achhe din. Another big announcement by this government, met by plenty of table thumping by my friends on the other side of the well, was the extension of the 25% corporate tax to companies under a 400 crore rupee turnover. However, in keeping with this government's underhand tactics, even this headline-grabbing figure was meant to obscure the reality, because the government has actually failed to live up to its own promise of a universal corporate tax rate at 25% by fiscal year 20, which was announced in the fiscal year 16 budget by the then Finance Minister, Mr. Jaitley. And it's also failed to phase out all the tax anomalies that have led to such prolonged tax litigation in our country. As numerous analysts have repeatedly pointed out, India remains one of the least competitive economies, with the total effective tax paid by some corporates reaching an astronomical 48%, whereas organizations like CII have been calling for you to reduce the corporate tax rate to 18%. In comparison, all Chinese companies enjoy a flat corporate tax rate of 25%, with this dropping to 10% for certain small-scale or other encouraged businesses. And if the Chinese can thrive with that kind of approach, I don't know why we must tax our businesses. By not sticking to its own promise, the government has once again failed corporate India and missed out on a significant opportunity to actually encourage increased private investment in our economy. Respected Chairman, well, the macroeconomic picture of the country's economy was treated by the government rather dismissively by not mentioning it in the budget speech. The FM did spend quite some time building castles in the sand, particularly with her lofty vision for a decade, which includes this $5 trillion economy goal. And that's supposed to cater to the Asha, Vishwas and Akanksha of the people. But ask these same people what this target means to them, it actually is completely unimaginable, right? What will actually cater to their needs, their Akanksha, would be the GDP per capita in rupee terms, which goes directly into their pockets and matters to them. But according to the most recent World Bank classification this month of countries by gross national income per capita, India continues to be a lower middle income country along with 46 others, while even little Sri Lanka has climbed to the upper middle income group for the fiscal year 2020. What the government plans to do to increase the GNI, the gross national income of its citizens, to even the Sri Lankan level was strangely absent from the finance minister's presentation. Clearly, this imagination of an expanded dollar footprint of the country's economy represents only the Asha, the Vishwas and the Akanksha of the Sudbut Ki Sarkar, not that of the Aam Aadmi. So what does the government's budget leave for the Aam Aadmi? Honourable Finance Minister memorably invoked the father of the nation, quoting the Mahatma's immortal vision that the soul of India lies in its villages, and she went on to emphasize the government's apparent commitment to Gaon, Garib or Kisan. But for each of these categories, rural India, the economically and financially challenged in our society, and those who put food on our table, there was sadly very little for them to write home about. Take our nation's Kisans, those who provide the food security the FM mentioned. To these men and women, these last 5 years have been nothing but stepmotherly treatment from this government, which has resulted in record levels of farmer suicides. Yes, the budgetary allocation for the Ministry of Agriculture has gone up from the previous fiscal, very high, from 75.75 crores to 1.39 lakh crores. But if you look at why it's gone up, you realize that this essentially is only from the 75,000 crores that has been allocated this time for the expanded version of the Pradhan Mantri Kisan Samman Nidhi, PM Kisan, which of course provides an annual income transfer of 6,000 rupees to most of our farmers. Now, as we in the opposition have repeatedly pointed out, the PM Kisan scheme in its current form is clearly divorced from the reality of the acute agrarian crisis the country is facing. There are fundamental structural challenges that have not been mentioned, just a handout. Now, announced first in the interim budget earlier this year, the present government decided that the burden of the farmer was only worth a paltry 500 rupees a month. That's what 6,000 rupees a year comes to. So, in their pitiable attempt to reach out to a community where the average annual indebtedness of an Indian farmer stands at 47,000 rupees, did the government really believe that a 500 rupee note would provide relief to a farmer in the throes of existential despair? Do they believe that salvation will come to him in the form of 16.5 rupees a day, or even lower? For in the average rural household of 5 members, he would really mean 3 rupees a day, a staggering lower than 1/8 of the poverty metric of 27.2 per person, and much lower than they could earn through the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme that our party had brought in. No, the idea was not to provide genuine relief, but just enough money to win votes. Garib will forgive us if we change his famous lines a little and say, "Hazaron ख्वाहिशें हैं ऐसी कि हर ख्वाहिश से दम निकले, हजारों ख्वाहिशें ऐसी कि हर ख्वाहिश से दम निकले, हम चले थे किसान सुरक्षा करने, लौटे 500 रुपये लाए." So this cynical lip service to those who put food on our tables could not have come at a worse time. Just look at the situation. Just look at the situation. You made a song and dance in 2016 about doubling farmer income by 2022. Have you even come close to increasing farmer income? Your farmer incomes, in fact, in our country have fallen. You can check the data. Growth rate in the sector has been acknowledged by your economic survey as having slowed to a crawl. Input prices and therefore the cost of cultivation has gone up every year. But earnings have fallen every year. and the procurement system of MSPs has largely failed to assuage the crisis experienced by the debt-stricken farmer. To make things worse, the southwest monsoon, which accounts for 70% of India's annual rainfall, has so far seen a deficit of 26%, and that has led to a 27% decrease in planting in the Kharif season. Farmers across the country, as you know, have risen in protest last year, year before. They have marched in order to flag the attention of government that has consistently, systematically, and unconscionably failed them. What reception have their legitimate concerns received? In Delhi, they were ignored. In Nashik, they were harassed. And in Mandsaur, they were shot. Our Kisans could be forgiven for changing the words of another well-known shairi and saying, अलविदा कहते हुए जब मैंने शख्स से पूछा कि कोई निशानी तो दो, अलविदा कहते हुए जब मैंने शख्स से पूछा कि कोई निशानी तो दो, वो मुस्कुराते हुए बोले गोली ले लो. Under these grave circumstances, it is not surprising that the allocation for support schemes like the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, the government's flagship crop insurance scheme, has seen a modest increase. But in her address, even while the finance minister began by praising her government as one whose signature was last mile delivery, there has been no mention of the glaring loopholes in the Fasal Bima Yojana that undermine its supposed benefits as a crop insurance scheme. Since the implementation of the scheme, insurance companies have collected annual premiums far exceeding the payouts to the aggrieved farmers, and what they have paid has not been timely. Recent reports based on data from the government's own Ministry of Agriculture say that as of May 10, 2019, out of the 12,867 crore claims that have been filed and certified by concerned state governments, 40% of claims, that is 5,171 crores from the Kharif season that ended last year, remain unpaid. As you must be aware, according to the guidelines of the Fasal Bima Yojana, claims have to be paid within 2 months from the end of the harvest. But that means 2 months would have been February 2019 latest, but by May they hadn't been paid. For comparison, earlier, under the equivalent UPA schemes, the National Agriculture Insurance Scheme and the modified National Agriculture Insurance Scheme, the gross premium collected was 10,560 crores and total claims paid were 28,564. So in our scheme, insurance companies had to pay 3 times more than they collected. In the BJP scheme, your government scheme, the actual insurance companies are collecting more than they're paying out. No wonder enrollment in the Fasal Bima Yojana has fallen from 58 million farmers in fiscal year 17 to 55 million farmers in fiscal year 18. It only remains a golden goose for the insurance companies, and I must say, from a country that is suffering from such agrarian distress, we cannot afford to have a scheme that enriches the insurance companies but gives a raw deal to the poor farmer. Dil-e nadan, तुझे हुआ क्या है? आखिर इस दर्द की दवा क्या है? हम कौन सी वफा की उम्मीद में हैं जो नहीं जानते वफा क्या है? At the same time, there is very little investment in other schemes for farmers that could have actually helped them to reach their target of doubling farmer income. For instance, the allocation for agriculture-related research and education, which often offers very good returns on investment, has only risen marginally from 7,900 crores to 8,078 crores. So it's about 0.37% of the agricultural GDP, the same amount as before, far short of the 1% that is the globally accepted requirement target. There was also the mention of the return to zero budget farming, which is puzzling. उसका मतलब क्या है, फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर? आखिर हमारे किसानों का बजट वैसे भी जीरो है, as we all know. आप तो केमिकल फर्टिलाइजर सब्सिडी के लिए सिर्फ 9,000 करोड़ लिए हैं, और आप परंपरागत कृषि विकास योजना को सिर्फ 325 करोड़ दिए हैं. जीरो बजट तो सही है. प्रधानमंत्री कृषि सिंचाई योजना बढ़ाया है सिर्फ 17%, a marginal increase of 17%, और डीजल सब्सिडी जो देना चाहिए जब बारिश की कमी है, in rainfall deficit areas, वो सिर्फ आप 70 करोड़ दे दिए हैं। और ये सब आप जानते हैं कि ये सब हो रहा है जब देश की कई इलाकों में सीवियर ड्राउट चल रहे हैं। ये तो किसानों के लिए बिल्कुल जीरो बजट ही है, मिस्टर चेयरमैन। We can't afford to be misled by this government's rhetoric and empty promises. You can talk about doubling farmer income, but you have to walk the talk. तेरे वादे पर जिए हम तो ये जान झूठ जाना, तेरे वादे पर जिए हम तो ये जान झूठ जाना कि खुशी से मर न जाते अगर एतबार होता। So then there is the grand announcement of the Matsya Sampadya Yojana under the Department of Fisheries. Department of Fisheries, not the separate ministry long promised by this government. Government announced a separate ministry that will be in its national policy on fishing 2012 and promised it in its 2014 manifesto, and now with just a department you're claiming that your Yojana will introduce a robust fisheries management framework. As MP from Thiruvananthapuram, which has a significant fishing community, I'm just over halfway through, sir. We have a little more time. I have repeatedly pushed this government on the urgent need for a dedicated ministry.
The time that has been allotted to the party, you have already crossed.
Sir, I've crossed half an hour, sir. Just half an hour.
Half of it. You have already crossed half of it, and you have some other members also to
yes,
speak.
Yes, but 10-15 minutes at least make the key points. Because this is a source of livelihood for nearly 4 million of our country's citizens, sir. Most of the fishing communities are vulnerable groups. They live below the poverty line. A dedicated ministry could have solved their problems to some degree, but I'm told there is no rationale for the creation of a separate ministry. But the result is, the finance minister can talk about a blue revolution, but they have not allocated a single rupee for the strengthening of our coastline through our seawalls. In my constituency, from Palittura to Poyur, from Validura to Shangumukham, every single day large swathes of our coastal land is being washed into the sea as a result of widespread coastal erosion. It's affecting the homes, the livelihoods of lakhs of fisherfolk. But their repeated pleas, which I have raised 3 times in 0 hour in the last couple of years, have fallen on deaf ears. You've actually reduced the money for the coastal management program by 42% in your budget. When the ministry responsible is more concerned with cow protection than protecting fishermen, obviously it's better to be a cow than a Matsya Toilali in India today. But it's also part of a continuing pattern, sir, of the neglect of the needs of my state, Kerala. The money required for the rehabilitation of Cyclone Oki victims has not been provided. The same can be said by my Odisha friends about victims of Gaja. There is practically nothing for the victims of last year's Kerala floods either. Our fishermen are in terrible condition, yet they have shown great heroism in rescuing thousands of people in the floods. But our requests for help to rebuild Kerala have been rejected.
We have been globally recognized.
Globally recognized, but not by our finance minister, who has given nothing for rebuilding Kerala. Also, where is the corpus for rubber farmers, assistance for economically vulnerable immigrants returning from Gulf countries? We want their remittances, but we want to do nothing for the people who have been sending these remittances when they lose their jobs and come back. My request for establishing the National Institute of Medicinal Plants in Thiruvananthapuram has been continually overlooked, even though you claim to be in favor of traditional medicine. The promised National Ayurveda University, an institute of national importance, has not come either. Despite the government's big talk of promoting Ayurveda, it has failed to harness Kerala's great potential in this field, even though I had a public and oral commitment from the Ayush Minister when he came to Thiruvananthapuram last year. The plantation industry in South India is in terrible condition. It provides employment to 1.5 million workers, that too in remote areas, but there are no funds being given in this budget for the commodity boards. There's no proposal to upgrade the National Institute for Speech and Hearing in Thiruvananthapuram into a national university for rehabilitation and disability, also promised by this government in its previous avatar. So the fact is that we have some really serious challenges here, but Kerala is not the only example of the government's neglect. In her address, she barely scratched the surface of the greatest crisis facing India today, the crisis of jobs. After dismissing the findings from a leaked NSSO report earlier this year, the government did a full U-turn and released the same figures as per its own Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. And that shows a 45-year high unemployment. 6.1% of the total labour force is unemployed. 7.8% of all employable youth in urban areas jobless, 5.3% of rural India, and joblessness among men is at 6.2%. That's all very well for the finance minister to claim that India Inc. are India's job creators, but the fact remains that government's silence on this issue is truly shocking. What about the 2 crore jobs a year that this government used to talk about? We don't hear that anymore. We don't hear that anymore, and there are no successful schemes that for youth employment. You can call the youth Bhagya Vidatas, but you give them no jobs to create their own Bhagya. And this is worrying for more reasons than one. Let me stress that our demographic dividend is possible now, but it's definitely reducing because our population growth rate will slow down in the next 2 decades, and we will go through a democratic dividend phase which will end by the early 2030s. So we must really seize the last decade that's available to us. Otherwise, this government can justly be accused by history of squandering the golden opportunity on its watch. After all, why are you building a new India if not for the young? And the fact is that we have very, very severe challenges in that regard. I do want to say, Mr. Chairman, education is such a neglected area, it's rather sad. It's simply not this government's priority. They've increased the total allocation rather modestly, well short of the Kothari Commission recommendations, which are not even at half the level of the recommended 6% of GDP. And SC/ST students have been ill-treated because SC students, the budget estimate for post-matric scholarships for SC students has been slashed from 3,000 crores. The post-matric scholarships for ST students has also been reduced this year. And the allocations for fellowships and scholarships for PhD and postdoctoral students from the SC/ST community is also a similar tale. They've created this National Research Foundation, which may be fine in theory, but no one will know if the government is simply using it to centralize government control of research, clamp down on academic and intellectual freedom on our campuses and hold our universities to ransom, because it gives them control over what research they are allowed to do. And it's very, very worrying that at the same time, one of the few world-class institutions we have, the IIMs, their share of central allocations has fallen from 1,036 crores last year to just 445 this year.
Please conclude.
Yes, I'm coming to the key points. The key points at the very end. Starving education is bad enough. Allocation for defense was barely mentioned, and it represents a very modest increase from last year's allocation, the lowest since the 1962 war. And with all of that, it still comes at a time when the Parliamentary Standing Committee has been told that 68% of our Army's equipment is in the vintage category. Then the fact is that as far as the Army is concerned, the government enjoys saying things like, where's the Josh? But you ask the defense experts, their answer is, where's the money? There isn't money for all the needs this Army and the armed forces need to fulfill. There were plenty of other misses and half positives, but keeping in mind your request for the time, I'll just quickly, one sentence each. Environment, you talk about electric vehicles, but as I said, there is absolutely no grid or infrastructure to promote that. The allocation for the Environment Ministry is so abysmal that it is even less than what was spent on the statue in Gujarat. And there are substantive cuts for the National Green Tribunal, gone down by 74%. The Environment Protection Management and Sustainable Development Scheme has gone down, and merely 40 crores for the Climate Change Action Plan. Healthcare, Ayushman Bharat, same problem as the Fasal Bima Yojana. The insurance companies seem likely to gain. How much actually people are going to get, the numbers are not encouraging. Striking missed opportunity in the tourism sector, which many of you know creates 8 times the jobs of the same amount of money invested in industry, because it doesn't. You can absorb semi-skilled and unskilled workers in jobs that don't require much training, like waiters and doorman, busboy, gardener's assistant, etc. But you've given no major tax breaks for the industry, no incentives for PPP model tourism development, no encouragement to invest in jobs in this area. And so the fact is, there are definitely some things they have done that the Finance Minister pointed to and which won them votes, such as, for example, building toilets under Swachh Bharat. But the studies show that 65% of these toilets don't have running water.
Now you
so
have
how can they be open to defecation in India?
Mr. Member, you have to conclude now.
Yeah, I'm concluding, sir. The fact is, sir, that even, for example, the gas cylinders, 90% of the recipients can't afford to refill the gas cylinders. That's according to objective studies. So the fact is that these signs of Achhe Din are not terribly encouraging in terms of any concrete solutions. The fact is that there's a great deal that needs to be done to address all these sectors I pointed out, and I must say that it's extremely important, because if you want to truly respond to the akanksha of the Indian people, you need to actually address their real fears and hopes. As Ghalib pointed out, nazar ko badlo to nazare badal jate hain, soch ko badlo to sare badal jate hain. कश्तियाँ बदलने की जरूरत नहीं, दिशा को बदलो तो किनारे खुद बदल जाते हैं. We must remain faithful, sir, to the great inheritance of the previous 70 years if we're going to build a new India in the 21st century. And as far as the opposition is concerned, let me end by quoting the words of Makhdoom Moeddin, who said famously, hayat leke chalo, kayanat leke chalo, chalo to sare zamane ko saath leke chalo. हमें भी साथ लेके जाइए. All these schemes must involve the people of the whole country and not just some.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.